All right, Eugene Linden. Hello.
Hello, Sarah.
Thank you for coming on to log in my podcast.
Pleasure to be here.
I rented the view just for you.
Beautiful, magnificent view of New Jersey.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I think the primary view is behind us.
Yeah.
Sorry, next time we'll face that
it's
way.
good.
Yeah. Okay, so let's do a proper intro for you, and then I'll get to your books. You have quite a history of an incredible science career, a writing career. Why don't you kind of just give our listeners and viewers like a quick 101 on Eugene Linden?
Sure. Well, I started out as an investigative journalist in Vietnam. Wrote a story that turned out to be a big story, and when I came back, a bunch of publishers approached me and said, you want to do a book? You want to write about Vietnam? And I said, I don't think so. I've already written about what I wanted to say, and what do you want to write about? And without missing a beat, I basically said, I want to write about these experiments teaching sign language to chimpanzees, which had nothing to do with Vietnam, but it had everything to do with...
You were writing about the soldiers, right?
I was writing about the breakdown of the American Army.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Really
really light stuff. Yeah, exactly. That was quite an adventure in itself. In any case, the reason I wanted to write about these experiments is the language teaching. Apes were not meant to understand or be able to generate language, and that was meant to be the dividing line between human and animal. And if it turned out that apes could understand symbols or even use symbols or even understand what grammatical order meant, things like that, it overthrew several hundred years of concepts of human nature and a lot of Western philosophy. So I wrote that book. And the worst thing that happens if you're a writer is you have a moderate success, because then you have to keep writing and you're condemned to a life of poverty. Whereas if you fail, then you go on and do something lucrative, and
get into digital marketing.
Yeah, exactly, and end up rich and famous. So
right, yeah, we're working on the second part.
Right. So anyway, I wrote a number of books following that. Pretty heavy stuff, really. A book about the nature of charity, a book about the nature and origins of the consumer society. Then another book that got a lot of attention, which is what happened to the animals in the ape language experiments after the experiments were over. And I turned to other subjects. I wrote a book about the nature of the future. It's called The Future in Plain Sight. Wrote a couple more books about evidence of animal intelligence that did not come from studies, but came from just what they did. And those two books, Parrot's Lament and The Octopus and the Orangutan, were quite successful. Turned to climate change and wrote Winds of Change in 2006, which was about how natural climate change basically affected the course of human evolution and human history, civilizations in the past. Then did another book called The Ragged Edge of the World, because I've been to a lot of very remote places, and these are the stories I never got to tell, and that was a lot of fun to do. More recently, I went back to climate change and wrote a book called Fire and Flood, about basically how we got to where we are and why we've done nothing to address what is basically an existential threat. But a couple of years ago, I've written a lot, not just in books but in journalism and such, about the nature of intelligence. And also the nature of evolution. And one of the thoughts that kept occurring to me was, how is it that if intelligence is basically a product of evolution, and if evolutionary forces, which were for purely utilitarian reasons, which is what evolution is about, could produce consciousness and intelligence in human history, it was in a matter of a few 100,000 years, which is a blink of an eye geologic time. Maybe it's happened before.
Right.
And that thought experiment led to Deep Past. When I turned to fiction for the first time since I was in college. I wrote this sci-fi novel, which has to do with the discovery of evidence of an ancient intelligence. And the evidence is quite subtle. I'm not giving too much away here because it's the very beginning of the book, but discovery of some bones, very large bones in Kazakhstan, and they seem to be arrayed in parallel. And then they find out how old these bones are, 5.3 million years, and the question is, how did they get arrayed? And whose were they? Because these turns out to be from some ancient form of elephant, and our ancestors back then were pipsqueaks.
Right.
So they weren't going to be using these bones as weapons or anything like that.
What are you saying? We were gerbils, or?
Well, we were much larger. I mean, well, actually, we were a lot larger.
Okay.
But we weren't the kind of things that would be wielding these massive ulnas as a weapon.
Right.
And so then this woman anthropologist, who's basically the protagonist in both books, she is led to this discovery, and much of the plot in Deep Past turns on her efforts to try to be taken seriously, at the same time protecting the discovery and not being relegated to crypto science or fringe science. And a lot of the book is an exploration of what it takes to be taken seriously by the scientific establishment, particularly if you're a woman and an outsider. And
I remember when you first came to me talking to me about this project, I started kind of reading up on the book, and I was like, oh wow, a very brave man to take on the emotions and thought process behind a female scientist. Remember I brought that up?
Yes, I know.
And I was like, oh man, there's no way he did it. And then I read it and I was like, yeah, okay, pretty accurate. Good job.
Well, maybe I have a stronger feminine size.
You must. Embrace it.
Right.
Claire, you're Claire, aren't you?
No, Claire's a lot of different people. She's no one person. But I over the course of my career, I've had the privilege of knowing a lot of very intrepid and imaginative and original women scientists, a lot of them.
Yeah,
and,
you said Jane Goodall is one of them.
Jane,
she's got some immediate name recognition.
Right. I traveled with her for National Geographic, but a lot of different women scientists in the cognitive sciences and things, and they've all been very tough, they've all been very disciplined, and it just takes an extraordinary amount because, science is less so now, but it's still a male-dominated world, and it's tough to be taken seriously. And it's particularly tough to be taken seriously when your discovery is world-changing.
Yeah.
I mean, this is not, finding a new form of clam.
Right.
It actually would overturn all sorts of concepts of nature of intelligence, because the evidence, the sort of teasing glimpses of this intelligence in Deep Past, are that it's a very different kind of intelligence than human intelligence, and it's extraordinary. So imagine, you're asking the scientific establishment to accept that there's this new species, that this new species was as smarter than we are, died out 5 million years ago.
Smarter than humans? No. No, I'm kidding. I mean,
you can go into therapy.
I know. I was talking to someone about this yesterday, how, we think we're so smart, but we just judge by our own metrics.
And then also what, a very different type of intelligence might be like. So all of this comes out, and it's all embedded in this plot because geopolitics gets involved. This is in Kazakhstan.
Of course.
And I wrote the Deep Past before Russia invaded Ukraine, but one of the plots involves Russia seizing part of Kazakhstan. So maybe that might be next on their checklist.
Well, let's hope not.
Yeah, exactly. But so she's not just struggling for scientific credibility, she's also struggling for her life, it turns out. And, we bring in a couple of evil Russian oligarchs and as part of this
when
plot.
It fits,
Right.
If it fits.
It's on shelf A over here. No, but I have all these subplots because this one of the people involved in this mining concession where the bones are found is the chief geologist, who turns out to be Russian and turns out to be sort of in exile because he's run afoul of this oligarch because he humiliated the oligarch in a chess match in front of his fiancée. And so anyway, there were all these
I remember now. I read that book last summer, so yeah, I'm remembering now. That part that it was a chess match.
That's right. Well, and then I had to do a quick intensive course on chess and found this one very, very, I'm not going to give it away, but notable match where my Sergei, the good Russian, comes up with an imaginative way of solving this very complicated chess problem. So anyway, there's a lot in the book.
And then you have to say there's a little bit of a love story here as well.
Yeah, well, Claire deserves somebody.
For sure. And I loved watching her kind of, I don't know how you did it. I really don't know how you did it, but you managed to capture that struggle when she's being professional, and then, she meets Sergei. Like, you did a great job with that.
Well, you live a long time, you have a few experiences. You go to the memory bank. I don't know.
Please tell me that you fell in love on location somewhere, digging up bones.
Journalists are legendary. But
yeah,
Sergei's a very interesting character because he's very witty and funny and incredibly smart and imaginative. And at key points, he comes up with a solution where it seems like there's no solution available. Another key character, which turns out to be key in Deep Past, is a scientist named Willem Kierbrock, a very famous scientist. And actually, I did model him on somebody, but I'm not going to name him. But astute readers of the book could probably figure out his name. I'm not going to give any more hints.
Okay, so there's some science gossip here.
Yeah. All right. But in any case, he, at one point, actually humiliated Claire during a oral defense of her PhD.
Yeah, I remember.
On an early project, and yet he's the one person she thinks who could give credibility to this project. So she musters her courage and brings him back in. And at first he's resistant, but he turns out to be absolutely crucial to the discovery seeing the light of day. But in any case, with this book, I brought everybody to the point where, there's evidence of this incredible intelligence that was very different than ours. It seems to have something more to draw from quantum mechanics than from Newtonian physics. And then at the very end of the book, there's a few things they discover. One, I don't want to give too much away in this because I hope people will read Deep Past.
Yeah, but you kind of got to give something away so that they go.
Well, they discover evidence that that this ancient species of elephant left a kind of memory of what they were like, but it can't be decoded by our tiny little human auditory capacity, you know. And so one of the main characters in the book goes rogue, shows this evidence to elephants, and they go berserk. And so the book ends with, that there's some record of what this animal was like, but we don't know what it was. We have glimpses of the intelligence. So, and then finally, towards the end of the book, actually, she's kind of clumsy, Claire, and she's, like, a couple of bones get broken because she's gone rogue. But
she went rogue. She got a little crazy. We forgive her.
And then, but she discovers this thing and accidentally drops it, and it reveals something that contains a full strand of DNA, or would. And so that's the way the book ends. So, in Resurrecting Bart, the sequel, Claire, a few years later, has got a kid now with Sergei. Most of the team is scattered, a few have remained together, but they still have this evidence of this, and they want to know what it's like. And then they get the idea, maybe we can they nicknamed this ancient elephant Bart, by the way. Yeah. Because he's got a pronounced forehead and he's sort of like Bart Simpson.
Okay. I didn't really connect that. I love Bart Simpson.
Yeah, well, who doesn't? There's a whole thing in the book about trying to turn Bart Simpson into a scientific name. But anyway, so she reassembles a team. The key core people in the team, and says, including Willem Kierbrock, and they decide, the whole issue is, they'll launch this project to bring back Bart. And then they realize...
To bring Bart to life.
To basically de-extinct a creature that's been extinct for 5 million years.
Yeah.
And they're all wrestling with all the moral issues involved in that. Because again, if you bring back a clam, you don't care.
Right.
The clam doesn't care. It says, oh.
Well, so far that we know of. Let's leave room.
You know some
let's
smart
leave
clams?
room. Let's leave room.
Are some clams
for-
smarter than others? I mean,
Maybe. We don't know.
does
Do
that
you
mean
know?
I can't eat clams oregano anymore?
I've cut out a lot of foods.
Cutting out clams is going to be tough, particularly since they don't have brains. But
they're a muscle, right?
well, yeah, but I mean, they don't have eyes, really.
Some of them do have
no, they
eyes.
can sense light and dark,
Right.
for the most part. No, they're distant related to the octopus, which is very smart, and that is a.
So there's a chance.
Yeah. Well, in any case,
Anyway.
they're wrestling with these moral issues about, is it right to bring back an animal? It's going to be lonely. Is it going to be lonely? How to give it a life, how to prevent it from becoming a freak show object, how to say, if it has these powers, not just good guys are going to want these powers.
Yeah.
And how to protect it, how to give it a life, how to keep it out of and so everything has to be done in incredible secrecy, which means a very small team. And a lot of the early part of the book has to do with, like, how do you assemble a team that would have all the necessary parts to sort of transfer this DNA into the egg of an elephant, impregnate an elephant, and then have it be a surrogate mother to this creature, right?
Yeah.
And how to do that in utter secrecy, and then where this baby could be born, where it would not be in the spotlight, where it would not be, constantly in danger.
Yeah, and you picked a interesting location.
Well, again, I've been to a lot of remote places, and so my entire previous career was like a scouting operation for where, if I wanted to bring back an extinct elephant, where I would do it. And,
Were you thinking that then?
No.
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 Then you were like, how do I survive?
Yeah.
Which, by the way, your social media has a lot of tips on
Yeah, well,
interesting
a lot of them are
survival situations that
basic.
Eugene's put himself in.
Yeah, basic things. I mostly don't do what
Basic
I do.
things, not quite, not exactly basic. It's like, oh, what do you do if the floor is covered with 6 inches of ants?
Well, this was born of experience. I
Yeah,
didn't-
exactly.
It wasn't a hypothetical. It actually happened. So, but
Yeah.
in any case,
By the way, you leave that area if you need an answer to that question.
you leave quickly.
You leave quickly, yeah.
Right. Yeah, that's why I say basic.
Yeah.
It's like, and then you jump in a swamp and assume that you can hold your breath longer than an ant.
And ants float too, so.
Yeah, but I mean, that's exactly what we did. We ran to the swamp and jumped in and held our breath.
Miserable.
When we came back, they cleared out. No, but,
Now you know.
Yeah. But in any case, so I think I came up with a pretty appropriate place that turned out to be the right place to raise this animal, because of the fundamentally different nature of its intelligence. And it's not giving too much away, but raising it in a place like New York City, where there's constant, all different spectrum waves assaulting us, would have driven this animal stark raving mad.
Oh, right, yeah.
So, I mean, so where it actually turned out to be raised might be the one place on Earth where there are no, microwaves or of any sort of, or sound waves or
radio waves
or any technology-generated waves, and also a perfect place, as a kind of haven. And but even so, as things happen, people get wind of this, and because what happened is after she published on the bones, she kind of disappeared, and it caused a furor, as it would, like a complete furor.
Yeah.
And yet she's not publishing anything. So in order to to sort of get the surrogate mom elephant to a place where she could have the baby in peace and all that other stuff, they set up this elaborate misdirection, which we nicknamed, or she, well, I did it, but Claire nicknames Operation Buzzkill because she basically wants to do something with completely boring.
Yeah.
And so she has a conference well away from where all the real action is going on. Any case, it turns out some bad guys, including an incredibly smart but somewhat hapless Russian named Dmitry, who's like a brilliant hacker, and amoral and very amusing, but also just constantly in and over his head with everybody and running for his life and everything else. And he gets wind of it through a series of happenstance events, as luck would have it. And they end up in this long-term struggle to protect the elephant from these guys who would use it for their own purposes. And that turns out to be quite complicated in its own right, but only in Russia.
You grapple with a ton of interesting themes here. A lot on science and the responsibility of playing with God, that kind of stuff.
Playing God.
Playing God, yeah. What provoked that? Where did that come from?
Well, because any issue, what you ask yourself these questions. I've written a lot about some of the philosophical implications about captivity with the higher mental ability animals and things like that. And it's always, it's always a gray area because, almost all of them are endangered in the wild.
Yeah,
on
true.
the one hand, you want to protect them. On the other hand, you want to give them a meaningful life. On the other hand, we're learning more and more. Like when I started writing about animal intelligence decades ago, the conventional wisdom was they were wind-up toys, that they didn't feel pain, much less think about anything. And there's been a total paradigm shift, a revolution in thinking about animal consciousness since then. And it's kind of a fascinating transformation because recently there was a letter to Nature, I think it was signed by dozens of scientists saying, we recognize that consciousness extends far lower on the phylogenetic scale than we previously imagined.
Wow.
And they're even crediting some insects with evidence of awareness.
I have heard this.
Yeah. But what it means, and there are profound implications to this. One, it means there's continuity between human abilities and others, and that evolution produced some forms of different types of awareness, maybe lesser, not as sophisticated, certainly not as intricate as ours, in many different creatures, right? Mm-hmm. Octopus is a notable example because it's a mollusk. The other thing it means, though, and this has some bearing on artificial intelligence, is that to some degree, consciousness is not a product of computing power. It's really a product of architecture. In other words, it's a byproduct of something. For instance, in the octopus, it's got a dazzling array of weapons and camouflages and things it can do to hide, flee, but it has so many that it needs some decision-making capacity to decide what to do in a novel situation.
Yeah.
And Don Griffin, the great hard scientist and one of the fathers of the study of animal intelligence, argued that it's incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to hardwire a creature for every eventuality. And so that he argued that consciousness was evolutionarily efficient. In other words, that it was a better way, some degree of it. Yeah, you hardwire a lot, but then you leave some capacity for decision making. All right, so I'm thinking about all these things, and you can't think about them without circling back to the moral implications, which is where we started out talking about this. But of what that means and what our rights to do stuff are, and that has to be. Unless we're monsters, it has to be something that affects our decisions.
Yeah.
It's
well, you would hope so. That recognition of consciousness, at least.
Yeah. So.
Okay, beautiful. I actually have a ton of questions for you that I will try to keep to a minimum, and I don't want to give any spoilers away for your book or your books.
No more than I already have.
Right. One of them actually is why elephants. So you, out of all the animals that you've worked with and researched, obviously you've dedicated now 2 books to Bart the elephant.
Yeah.
Why?
Well, elephants are the largest brained land animal.
Okay.
Vastly bigger brain than we have. A lot of it has to do with sound processing. And what I did in deep past, I figured I'd probably want this ancient intelligence to be a land animal. One, finding bones of ancient, whales or dolphins is very difficult, and
I wouldn't know.
Anyway, we're in Kazakhstan, and years and years ago there were elephants in Kazakhstan.
Okay.
And so second, they've got this very large brain. And then what I did imagine, because I'm going to take a little digression here, because the Ice Ages started about 2.7 million years ago.
Okay.
So there's some scientists, Richard Potts at the Smithsonian, and he and a bunch of others have argued that during the Ice Ages, our hominid ancestors, the specialists tended to die out, and the generalists tended to survive. The generalists tended to have smarter brains. So
that's actually great news for me. I feel like as a human being, I'm more of a generalist.
There you go. And so I'm not. Yeah. Well, you can carry this through. But in any case, so his argument was that and during the period of the Ice Ages, we were to some degree a product.
Totally.
Of the challenges of the Ice Ages and adapting and becoming more of a general species.
Yeah.
And then once we got into groups, there's a secondary set of selective pressures that said things like cooperation and things like that are important,
yeah.
And social intelligence becomes
community,
important, and all that stuff. So in any case, you can see how selective pressures run amok, so to speak, could produce intelligence in a relatively short period of time.
Right. Mm-hmm.
All right. So.
Oh no! Now I'm thinking about all the internet stuff. I'm like, oh no, where are we gonna go?
We're going backwards with that. But,
oh no.
So, and then I thought, well, all right. So, how can I create the circumstances that would isolate some elephant group and force them to sort of a bunch of selective pressures that might hasten the development over hundreds of thousands of years of a super smart race of elephants.
Okay.
And of course, plate tectonics sitting right there doing it for me.
Right. Of course.
Of course.
That's where naturally you would go into that.
Like, so 5 point whatever million years ago. All right. 5, I don't know. Not sure if it's 5.7, 5.8. There was what's called the Messinian salinity crisis, and shifts in the
Heard of it?
in the plates actually walled off, basically walled the Strait of Gibraltar from the Atlantic, so that seawater didn't enter the Mediterranean.
Oh, right.
And over hundreds of thousands of years, the
bringing
Mediterranean
back memories now.
completely dried up. And at the bottom of thousands of feet deep, at the bottom of this thing, it was like 160 degrees or more, and so it completely desiccated the region. And I hypothesized this scenario in which it created this basically island where the elephants couldn't escape from this part of Kazakhstan, and were sort of forced onto their own devices, so to speak, and and that's how this kind of very, very different form of intelligence emerged. So that was kind of fun.
And there's kind of stories like that on, even now, like islands will have specific birds, and that's.
Well, there's a whole thing called island biogeography, but also what's called the island rule. And this was discovered years ago. It was somebody named J. Bristol Foster. And then E.O. Wilson is famous, for island biogeography. But in any case, islands are by definition isolated ecosystems. And so there's all sorts of fabulous stories about these places. Like, big animals tend to get smaller because they don't need to be big because there aren't any predators or fewer predators. And so on Crete, in ancient times, there was a mammoth that basically shrunk to the size of a Great Dane.
Oh, wow.
All right. And then in the island of Anguilla,
kind of hard to
there was a rodent that got to over 300 pounds. So basically, the island
Whoa.
rule created a mouse bigger than an elephant when you get down to it.
Oh my gosh.
So,
Well, I love Anguilla, but I don't know if I can go there anymore. Knowing this.
Yeah, I think this thing went extinct several hundred years ago.
But somewhere out there, this needs to be like a children's book.
Well, having the Crete mammoth meet the mouse and being afraid of it or something. Yes, because the mammoth could be afraid of an elephant. But in any case, so you can have all sorts of fun with this island rule and how it distorts evolution. And as E.O. Wilson, I'm quoting him directly, said it opens the door of ecological opportunity. And so you get all sorts of weird creatures and birds. But one of my favorite stories is there's an island off Madagascar, and a bird flew in this island because there were no predators. It lost the ability to flight over thousands of years.
Wow.
Then the island flooded and killed off all the birds.
Oh no.
So
God.
then pretty much the same species flew back in,
Okay.
repopulated the island,
Okay.
lost the ability to fly
No.
over thousands of years. The island flooded again, and they were killed off, and this happened like 3 times.
Oh my God.
So the island
Depressing.
rule works as long as the island remains the same.
Oh my
It doesn't work so
God.
well when a new element has arrived, and
They need a new island. Those birds need to stop going there.
or they need somebody to say, keep flying.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah,
don't,
like-
you're going to need it someday.
Yeah, totally.
Don't. The wings are actually useful. I mean, Cuba had all sorts of flightless birds, and then when humans came 6,000 years ago, whenever it was, it sort of started wiping
So
them
the
all out.
flightless birds, they just can't fly very far, or
No, they can't fly at all, like a 3-foot-tall owl that sort of walked along the forest floor, that sort of thing.
Wow, crazy.
But without predators, and then that's the story of New Zealand. When I love cats, but when cats came into New Zealand, all those poor birds. Same thing with Hawaii, as you probably know.
Yeah.
That just laid eggs on the ground. They were, and a big fat target on their chests.
Yeah.
No. But in any case, so there's a lot of ecological science and stuff like that has informed my writing of the books.
One of the things that you kind of talk about is this, for elephants, this intelligence that, elephants maybe talk to each other and they lay kind of paths for each other to find water and to discover medicinal properties through fruits. And I read an article that not that long ago that they think that there's evidence that this is a real thing.
Oh, it's totally a real thing.
Right. So can you kind of explain a little bit more about this?
Well, I mean, they get to know the forest around them, and it turns out that, I think there's a bark on a tree in Africa that eases postpartum pains, and the natives use it, and elephants use it.
It's crazy.
For the same reason. They kind of discover.
And they share it amongst
pharmacology.
themselves. Yeah.
Elephant pharmacists.
Wild.
Well, elephant. One of the signs that an animal is dependent on culture is how long an animal lives after its reproductive life is over, a female. Mm-hmm. Like sperm whales, the females live like 40 or 50 years after their reproductive life is over. So that shows that the whale pod, needs the female for what she knows.
Right, like the grandmother type.
Well, the same is true. Same is true for elephants to some degree. They live a long time past their reproductive life.
How long do sperm whales live until?
I don't know, 90.
Oh, wow.
Right whales, there's some right whales that are probably 250 years old. They find right whales in the North Atlantic with stone harpoons in them from the 19th century.
Oh my God.
I mean, some whales,
That's kind of mind-blowing.
when you don't have gravity, that takes along one of the things that really ages people.
Right, yeah.
But just imagine
Or
not
the
having
sun.
to deal with gravity ever.
Yeah. That would be nice. I would like that. Well, and turtles too. Like there's some really old turtles out there.
Yeah, but it's the land turtles that live forever.
Yeah, like hundreds of years.
180 years old. I think his name is Gus.
Mm-hmm.
And the Aldabran turtles live forever. But their heart beats about 1 time an hour. I mean, it's like their metabolism is very, very slow.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
They're slow. If you ever see them walk, it's excruciating. All right, let's see what else we got on here for you. Oh, I also wanted to talk about parrots. That seems to be a little bit of a theme.
Oh, yeah.
And I personally like parrots. One day I would like to have a parrot. When I was little, my grandmother had a parrot.
Oh.
Why did you bring a parrot into this, and what does it have to do
Well, I
with the
mean,
intelligence?
that part of Africa is home to millions of African gray parrots, and African gray parrots are incredibly gregarious, incredibly social, incredibly loud, and incredibly smart.
Yeah.
I mean, you've all heard of Alex, Irene Pepperberg's parrot, who she taught dozens of words, understood all these different, very sophisticated concepts about sorting and things like that. But at some point in the book, and I'm not going to spoil this, Bart needs to deliver a message to his human caretakers. And he has, it turns out, and again, I'm not giving too much away here, one of his powers seems to be some sort of like active ESP of some sort, where he can influence and remote viewing, but also influence how others think and feel and stuff.
I love that you went there, though. Like, I think all of these are, it's like science, but then there's a little bit of, pseudoscience, or not quite science yet. Like you kind of play with some
I
elements
hope it's
there.
not pseudoscience, but it's science
Well,
fiction.
right, it's science
meaning that
fiction,
it's
but the remote,
plausible
but there's
science.
plausible science. Like there's people out there that claim to be remote viewers. I've seen some crazy things from people who have been able to pull out information from what seems like nowhere that's accurate. It's cool that you went there with this and have a science background and still kind of manage to play in that way.
Well, I think the sort of key element that connects all these things is what is come to be called quantum reality, which is somewhat different than quantum mechanics. Quantum mechanics is a set of equations, right, and probabilities.
Yeah.
Quantum reality has to do with like this notion of entanglement. That things can be connected in ways that are just seem physically impossible.
Right.
And that, by the way, is I wrote about quantum entanglement for Time magazine way back in 1991, I think, in a cover package on the future of physics. And I got a lot of heat for what I wrote about this guy back then who did an experiment on it, basically showing it to be real. 30 years later, this guy won the Nobel Prize for that exact work. And it's turned out to be the basis of quantum computing and all the different aspects of...
so is it essentially saying that it's not random, like the universe?
Well, the entanglement part is if you pass two photons, for instance, through a field, they become oriented. They're paired in orientation.
Oh, right.
And then if you split them and send them to the opposite end of the universe, if you pass one of those photons at the opposite end of the universe through another field, instantaneously, its paired twin should change its orientation, and yet that violates the speed of light.
Was this,
which is called non-locality.
Was this what they were doing in CERN?
No.
Oh,
no, it's somewhat different.
Sorry.
Oops. I don't know.
Different science
this
thing.
was UC Berkeley was one of the experiments, but in France they did a couple.
But I did hear this.
Well, it's become a really big deal, and then in 2023, that's when they awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics for it.
Cool.
Because it was hard to avoid. The guy who there's an Irish mathematician who basically showed a way to empirically test this. He should have won the Nobel Prize, but they don't give the Nobel Prize to dead people.
Oh.
So, and then, by the way, there's probably a hell of a lot of deserving Nobel Prize winners who just had the misfortune of dying just before they were about to be given it.
Right.
Well,
very cool.
Yeah.
All right, let's see what else we got in here. We touched on quite a few things. Kind of what about this? What do you think about humanity's relationship with nature?
Well, I mean, that's the core of what I've been writing about forever. I mean, that basically is trying to understand that relationship and whether it's by definition inevitably exploitive or whether it can be more harmonic, and more not harmonic in harmony with the needs of the natural world. It kind of has to be because this is where we live.
And you would say that we're not harmonic with the natural world?
No, that was my book, Affluence and Discontent, which basically showed that the incentives for using nature for the short term dwarf any taboos or religious prescriptions or even moral things that serve the long-term needs of preserving ecosystems. I would say indigenous people, some of them had wonderful cosmologies that were, in harmony with nature, and others were just so small it didn't matter how rapacious they were, they weren't going to harm nature,
Mm-hmm.
But we're 8 billion people, and we cough and the world gets pneumonia. So that's, we have to kind of figure this out or we're all doomed. And it's not like nature is doomed, because it's not like you can destroy ecosystems and then humans can survive. I mean, we look at fresh water,
Mm-hmm.
Look at, the needs of farming and climate change in farming. What we tend to take for granted is that the last 10,000 years, up until very recently, like the last 30 years, the last 10,000 years before that were maybe the most benign climate period in human history.
Mm.
And during that period, our numbers went from, a few million to 8 billion. That's not an accident.
Right.
It's because the weather was pretty good. And then during things like the Little Ice Age, population of Europe stalled for a few hundred years during that, and because we need good weather.
Yeah.
All right, so you warm the planet too much,
okay.
and what happens to the breadbaskets?
Right.
And we have an exquisitely balanced food system.
Yeah.
Where we're already co-opting much of nature for feeding ourselves, and you change the temperature too much and raise it too much, crop yields drop. And all of a sudden that's out of balance, and then you could have this cascade of events that we could truly get out of control. So it has to happen. I mean, climate change it's not a whisper in our ear, it's a cannon shot into the side of our head.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that.
Well, we haven't done anything. I mean, every year sets a new record for CO2 emissions, and yet half the population doesn't think it's ever going to affect them.
Why do you think the population doesn't understand climate change?
Because it became politicized in the late 90s, and once an issue becomes politicized, facts don't matter. If the messenger is deemed to be illegitimate, then you just disregard it. And that's what's happened with a lot of people thinking, and Trump's still saying it's a hoax, and bravely pounding his chest about we're going to drill more oil and coal than ever, and that's just only going to hasten this day of reckoning.
Is there a way that you could tell the average person, hey, go look around in this way, it's impacting you directly? I mean, I think
I've been trying to do that for 30 years. Books, cover stories for every major publication. And no, it hasn't worked. What is going to get the message across is prices, because you may not care about climate change, but your insurer does, and your banker does. And if your insurance rates quadruple because you're at higher risk for fires in the LA, or floods, or windstorms in Florida,
or snow in Florida.
Right.
That just happened.
Yeah, I know. In New Orleans, right?
Yeah.
That is going to send a message, and that's an apolitical message, because what could happen is that an insurance crisis could quickly become a banking crisis. Because if you can't get insurance for your house, you can't really sell it, and nobody can buy it unless they want to pay cash.
Right.
And that's not available. And
why would they want to pay cash if you can't get insurance for the house? And then
Well,
it also it's a high risk.
if they're rich, they could. I mean, but the rich aren't very many people. But the point is that in most cases, the bank owns more of the house than you do.
Right.
Your equity's 25%, the bank owns 75% of it.
Yeah.
So it's the bank that is on the hook if it can't sell the house for the 75% of the price that you paid for it. And what happens is that buyers dry up, and that's what happened in 2008. Only in the case of climate change, 2008, it was like a one-off. We had a real estate crisis that led to a banking crisis, right?
Mm-hmm.
With climate change,
And then it led to me not being able to get a job.
well, that was probably...
Yeah, I graduated college in 2010 in a recession, so.
Yeah, oh, God. Anyway, but with climate change, if we have that kind of insurance banking crisis, it's not going to get better the next year. Like what's going to happen in LA is they're going to have another, wet year, which is going to lead to an explosion of grasses and bushes.
Oh, right.
And then it's going to have another drought. And then the Santa Ana winds are going to come back and drive it down, humidity down to 5%. And another part of LA is going to catch fire, or another part of the Orange County, or another part of the Central Valley.
Because they were dealing with floods like a year before this.
Well, yeah, because again, once the area burns, then the roots no longer hold the soil. So when the rains come, there's not ground cover to hold the soil, and you get these mudslides and things like that. So, this is something that is going to be happening more and more. And like, we had Hurricane, Helene, it hits North Carolina, Asheville of all places, which was regarded as one of the safest places in the country from climate change, and basically destroys the town. And that's going to happen more and more. And then what we also see happening is that, these hurricanes intensify incredibly rapidly in 24 hours, going from Category 1 to Category 5. And that's a novel thing. And that's because of the incredibly warm waters in the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean. And then the weakening of the jet stream as the Arctic warms means that the steering winds that sort of sweep a hurricane once it makes landfall out to sea and up slowed down. And so you have these hurricanes that are moving at the pace of a leisurely walk across Florida. And what that means, instead of dropping 4 inches of rain, they drop 26 inches of rain.
Right.
And then hit Orlando, where like only 2% of the people had flood insurance because they never expected to have floods with rainfall. So all these novel things happen, and many of them they're almost unnoticeable on their own, but you put them together and they become a perfect storm of calamity. And so even that's what's so just mind-boggling to me, is that even after Helene and after what happened in LA recently, that there's a certain faction of the Republican Party that just heaps scorn on climate change, even after they're paying the bills for it.
Yeah.
Because actually, a lot of the red states are the ones that are most in the crosshairs of climate change. Texas, by the way, being one of those states.
Yeah, I know. I grew up there. It was multiple times a year, you're in the basement hiding from tornadoes.
Right. And again, we have, it's unclear, but I think there have been more high-intensity tornadoes. There's more energy in the system, so it stands to reason at the edges of the system you're going to have more extreme events.
One of my questions is, do you think that if things continue in this way, that people will have to, like, humanity will have to surely adapt to these extremes?
Yeah, but one of the ways they adapt is they move.
Right.
And that leads to immigration, which is already a problem, and migration.
Ugh.
And of course, that's why you get authoritarian regimes in Europe, because of waves of migrants coming from North Africa and the Near East. And there's no room at the inn, right?
Yeah.
And that's what's one of the border crisis here is, that's not driven by climate change, but one component of migration to Europe is driven by climate change, as parts of the Middle East become uninhabitable. So this is, and then these things don't happen in a vacuum. So they breed. All right. So then the xenophobia becomes more prevalent, and then you get all sorts of social reactions and financial reactions that are unanticipated. So yeah, I mean, we're basically Wally Broker, who is a world famous geophysicist, famously called climate change an angry beast, and he said, and we're poking it with sticks. And he said this 20 years ago, but he was exactly right.
Thank you for that. I think you have a very unique perspective considering how much you have covered the subject and also, living through the current time.
Well, when you think about it, I've written about it forever. Bill McKibben, Al Gore, famously. I mean, everybody. David Wallace Wells, bestseller, Uninhabitable Earth. Books are bestsellers. Evening news. And yet, we're living in 1990 in terms of whether the public is ready to do anything about it.
Right.
This is 30 years. Here's a couple of points that are kind of put it in perspective. Some 3 billion people have been born since climate changed.
Okay.
I mean, we first started to get these hot years in the 80s, but then in the 90s, it was undeniable that climate had changed from our baseline of the last couple of hundred years, but several thousand years. So we have 2 generations of people who've never known a normal climate.
Right.
And grown up amid this. And when you think about that, it's kind of astonishing. And then you also think 3 billion people. How many tons of CO2 to the average person? Well, if you're in Africa, it's just a few tons. In the United States, it's 13 tons. So the United States, our population's gone up 100 million. It's another couple of billion tons of CO2 just from population increase into the atmosphere. So the rock is that much bigger, the hill is that much steeper, and calamity is that much closer, and yet we're still largely oblivious.
So upsetting. Is there any kind of anything optimistic that you have seen regarding?
I think that some countries are just going to get fed up with our inaction and impose tariffs. I advocate for a universal tariff that's tied to a step function, a certain percentage reduction in carbon emissions per country that is only imposed if you don't meet the target. I come up with all sorts of ways that it doesn't need to be a burden on the poor countries. But in any case, I mean, to me, that's a no-brainer. We could do it. It doesn't require new technology. It's hard to get anybody to say, yeah, let's do that. I think the prices are going to force, some places are going to become uninhabitable in the United States in the sense that you won't be able to sell your house or buy insurance. Mm-hmm. And so nobody's going to, people aren't going to want to live there. And what will happen is people are either riding on the wall and they might try to get out early. Mm-hmm. And that's what kind of happened in some of the suburbs of Phoenix and in Las Vegas in the housing crisis, as they sort of say, these prices are coming down. So they put their house on the market, before they were even thinking of it. And all of a sudden you have, a market flooded with houses and no buyers. And mm-hmm. So that kind of scenario could happen in a lot of different parts of the United States.
All right. Well, that also doesn't sound that optimistic, but I think it's better to be a realist when we're dealing with something so serious and present.
It's kind of hard to be optimistic. I mean, the UN process has been completely useless. What are we in, COP28, Congress of Parties? And it's 28 different meetings of all the world's countries producing absolutely nothing in the way of emissions reductions.
Yeah.
And there's technologies. All right, I'll be optimistic. I wrote about this for New Scientist, but there's a technology called deep geothermal. You go down 6 or 8 miles and you got 800-degree heat. The technology exists. It's actually borrowed from fusion technology to actually drill economically to that depth. Well, when you do think about it, all electric plant needs is steam. Doesn't care how the steam is produced.
Right.
So you could basically retrofit every single coal-fired plant in the world with this deep geothermal because it's universal throughout the Earth's crust. Mm-hmm. You don't have to go to geothermal hotspots. And produce electricity at $0.015 to 2 cents kilowatt hour, which would be the cheapest electricity on the planet.
Would you still have to drill You would still have to drill, though.
Yeah, but I mean,
Yeah.
you can do this drilling in a matter of weeks to months. I mean, it's being done. And there's a couple of companies that are exploring this. And, I think if that proves itself, that's like a deus ex machina. It's like a magic solution because it's virtually limitless free electricity, and it's zero emissions.
That would be nice.
Yeah, and in the U.S. we're only getting about 20% of our electricity from coal, but the rest of the world it's a lot higher, 60s, 70s, some countries.
Okay, so we're going to switch gears really fast, although I do really appreciate your take on some of these hot issues right now. Okay, so for Resurrecting Bart, can you tell me a little bit about what you would like the reader to take away in their reading process?
Sure. One, you always want. First of all, I wrote it to be a good read. I mean, it's supposed to be a page turner, and I hope I succeeded. But I mean, there are big questions that are sort of that float around it, and one is that this one I said it originally, and which is that if nature can invent a high intelligence like ours in the blink of an eye, who's to say it hasn't happened before? And the other thing you think about is if humanity, we were just as smart 10,000 years ago, 15,000 years ago as we are now. If we disappeared 15,000 years ago, 5 million years from now, there'd be probably zero evidence that any intelligent creature ever inhabited this planet. No one would know humans ever existed because we would have left nothing in terms of evidence that we existed.
Well, all would have crumbled.
Well, in 5 million years.
Yeah. Yeah.
A lot crumbles in 5 million years.
And grows, and it would just be a new layer on the Earth.
And then I want people to think about the nature of intelligence. Are there other forms of intelligence, and are there other ways of thinking about things?
I love that lesson.
And, and I thought, they're not giving much away again, but I bring in a Tibetan monk who does think very differently than we do. We tend to think about objects and the forces that act on them. It's the so-called stick and ball model, right? So we bound things together, and then we think it's affected by gravity, it's affected by this and that. But like the quantum world is also a wave world, and that's the world that's dominated by connectedness, right? So I hope people would.
And it can be unseen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I hope people would think about, what another type of intelligence would be like. And then I also, I have sort of side comments and, side discussions on the nature of the perils of celebrity, and how do you prevent an extraordinary discovery from becoming a freak show?
Right. Before I had read this, I never thought of it in that way. You always think it's going to be a good thing. But information getting out there and the world would be good, but then...
It's never only a good thing.
Right, exactly.
Because people are people, and some are self-interested.
Yeah. Yeah.
So another question is, are there discoveries that are too disruptive to be made public? Clearly, like if somebody discovered that Bigfoot was real, that would be a big deal, but it wouldn't be anything like discovering that there was this highly intelligent, this incredibly sophisticated, with near magical abilities animal 5 million years ago. Just imagine.
Right.
And how we would wrap our mind about it.
So Eugene, we have had you make some of these little clips online for your social media profile, and we've asked you extensively different questions about your time exploring the world. What are some standouts, just for people who are watching and listening, of
places I've been and stuff?
Places you've been, moments that have stood out to you that you want to share. There's plenty, but just right now.
Well, I mean, maybe the great trip I ever took was into the heart of the Ndoki in Nuabali, and on the border of Central African Republic and the French Congo. And because there's no evidence that anybody had been in this rainforest, which is the size of Belgium, for over 800 years. and the animals didn't run away.
Wow.
It was just a remarkable place, and in a way, it influenced the writing of this book. That readers will discover. Another place that I just was blown away by was the Kamchatka Peninsula in the Russian Far East. It is like extravagantly lush. It's got 17 active volcanoes or something like that. We camped on a river that was like not as big as the Hudson, but maybe a third the size, and was 108 degrees.
Oh.
It was basically a moving hot tub. And, I mean, and there were lakes with boulders the size of Volkswagens floating in the lakes.
Wow.
Volcanic material. Just this incredible landscape. They're always discovering new species of salmon. I mean, and almost nobody lives there.
Where in the Far East is this?
The most eastern part of Russia. It's a peninsula, and I was there, and I was traveling with a photographer, but I needed to get back to Petropavlovsk, the capital, and I started hitchhiking at midnight, with the sun out, and a car going by every hour, and I managed to get a ride. I mean, it's unbelievable.
Would you still do that now? Would you travel in that way now?
Not in Russia, because I want to go home at some point. But
right.
But there are other places I would.
Yeah.
And then another place is Antarctica. I mean, which is just the scale of the thing dwarfs the imagination. It's a continent the size of the Americas, and it's ice and 2 miles thick in many places. And we go to these places called the dry valleys, which have been dry for thousands and thousands and tens of thousands of years, because of the combination of evaporation and glaciation it's they're just these remarkable parts of Antarctica, and because it's at the end of the Earth, I mean, the very geophysics of this place play tricks on the imagination, and.
Like how so?
Oh, like one of my favorite stories, which I wrote about at one point, was like a seal might die, and it's on an ice floe, and the ice floe will break off and start floating out to sea, but because of the way the refraction of light waves, it might look like the seal is standing.
Oh, wow.
As it floats off.
Weird.
To its watery Avalon. And then there's another, seals would wander inland and get into these lakes in the dry valleys. And they, because the seal is a dark body, in the summer it'll die, and then in the summer it'll absorb heat and it will melt down into the ice until it melts low enough that ice forms above it, and then the ice forms from below, and then it'll rise up again and surface again, and it'll do this because it's never going to rot for thousands of years.
That's kind of like the Iceman,
Yeah, it's an antiseptic environment, and it's extraordinary. Although who knows if it's going to remain antiseptic.
Right.
And and then there's just been all sorts of places that, and one of the things remarkable encounters have been I've dealt with shaman and healers in various parts of the world, and just in the course of going into all these different places, I've picked up a lot of really exotic diseases, and never found. I went to the top tropical medicine doctor, couldn't get cured. Managed to get in contact with a Jingu healer, Zingu, I think is how you pronounce it, a very famous one, and his brother, and by God, they cured it.
Wow.
It was remarkable. And
through what kind of?
I'm not going to go into it because you won't believe me. But I wrote about it in The Ragged Edge of the World. I have a whole chapter on these.
And I think we do have a video of it. You explaining it somewhere.
Capturing the disease?
Yeah.
Okay. We probably did. So anyway, there've been, I've been lucky enough to go to a lot of places. I went out to where, in one part of in the heart of the Amazon, where Chico Mendes lived. And when I went there the first time, I chartered a little plane, and there's this tiny little airstrip, and we flew out and landed, and it was incredibly remote. Next time I went back, there'd been a superhighway built, so like these places don't remain remote.
God, that's so sad.
Yeah. Well, yeah. That's why I called it The Ragged Edge of the World, that book, because it's the active frontier where modernity, indigenous people, and wildlands meet. Yeah.
Right. Cool. I guess the last question I would have for you, you've written so many books, and I know we do have a lot of advice from you on it, but for someone who's just hearing you the first time, do you have any writer advice for them?
Well, it's a different world than when I started out. I wrote out my first book longhand.
My God.
And then typed it up.
Oh my God. How many pages was it longhand?
Several hundred.
Did your hand hurt?
Well, I was young.
Oh my God. I can't.
I couldn't imagine doing it today. But my point is that the technology has changed. I was probably one of the first people ever to write a book with a word processor, because I was a visiting scholar out in Stanford, and I was at this thing called the Institute for Research on Learning, and they had one of the very first word processors, and so I wrote a book on that.
Was it huge, like the size of the room?
Well, yeah. Well, it was connected to something huge, like the size of the room. The terminal was, but it was like, for me, it was miraculous. I don't have to retype the page. I can go back and erase that, and I was like, this is magic. And I think every other book I've written since then, I've written on a word processor. But I mean, the whole landscape for publishing has changed so much. The internet has destroyed the economic model for a lot of publications, like many of the ones I work for, and it hasn't done wonders for the publishing market either. But I would say that you don't need 340 million Americans reading books, and so even as the percentage of Americans who read books drops, the number of Americans who read books probably remains the same or goes up. And so we still should be able to support a vibrant, publishing landscape, publishing industry, sorry. And, but I do think it is incredibly tough. Now, maybe one of the hardest things, and this is just to give you an idea of what you're up against, is years ago, maybe a couple 100,000 books were published a year. After 2000, a million or so. The figure these days, just because of everybody has access to publishing, is like 10 million. Mm-hmm. So rising above the ambient noise level is just an almost impossible task. And on the other hand, the internet allows people to find things that they wouldn't find ordinarily.
Totally.
On the other hand, you have to cut through so much hay to get to the gems that it's.
Well, the algorithms are helping
give
that.
up.
Yeah, the algorithms are helping that now. But yeah, I know what you're saying.
Yeah, you would know this more than me, actually. This is your world.
It is.
I'm just a visitor.
All right. Well, do you have any parting knowledge for any of our listeners out there?
Don't give up.
Oh.
You can't. Anybody who has children, and I've got a lot, you want a world that they want to live in.
Yeah.
So it's our obligation to try and help make that.
Awesome. I couldn't agree with you more.
Thank you, Sarah.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for coming on.
My pleasure. Enjoyed it.
Okay, everybody. You can pick up his books, the one we're primarily talking about, Deep Past.
No, Resurrecting.
First Deep
yeah,
Past,
right.
And then the follow-up is Resurrecting Bart. Resurrecting Bart is coming out soon. Probably by the time this is out will be available, so please pick it up and let us know what you think. I hope you like it, and it's a from my own point of view, it's a great story. I got a lot out of it. As you can clearly see, Eugene has a ton of scientific knowledge that he's poured into this fiction writing, which is really what makes the book so special. So I hope you get it. And again, let us know what you think. Thank you.